Well, this morning I've been given the task of kicking things off with a rather small subject, merely the influence American religion has had on its foreign policy since, well, the beginning of time. And as Graham said, that's the subject of a book I'm writing, and it's one thing to cover that kind of topic in 400 or 500 or 600 pages, although my editor is probably, if he's listening, is probably worried that I'm increasing the page count by hundreds. But it's another thing altogether to try and do so in 35 minutes. So it'll be necessary for your patience, for my sanity, for me to radically summarize, to radically compress, to paint in broad brushstrokes, to highlight themes rather than facts, and to skip over periods and probably to leave out some things that you would think would be important in the story that I'm about to tell. And in the question and answer session that follows, I, of course, encourage you to force me to fill in those inevitably large gaps. I'll be focusing on some grand themes as I go through the talk, and as I said, skipping around large chunks of time. I'll be talking about exceptionalism, democracy promotion, religious liberty, the separation of church and state, and international organization, League of Nations, United Nations, and so forth. Well, religion, as you might expect, has had an important role in shaping American attitudes towards matters of war and peace, although most diplomatic historians would be surprised to hear that and would be actually hostile to that thesis. Religion itself hasn't really ever determined U.S. foreign policy. At least no major foreign policy decisions have been made by faith alone, and America has never waged war to spread the gospel. Rather, religion's importance to American foreign relations, and I would say its centrality, lies in two dynamics that are not in and of themselves about making actual policy, but about influencing those who do make policy. And I'm talking about ideas and activism. This is history from the below flowing upwards to influence those at the top. Religion has supplied both ideas and activism in abundance, and in the process has shaped the way in which American leaders make foreign policy decisions. For example, Woodrow Wilson decided to intervene in World War I not on any religious grounds. It was mostly due to German U-boat warfare and the American financial stake in an Allied victory, and other less religious reasons. But the ideas that came from his own deeply held faith did shape the manner in which America intervened. And of course, religious faith provided Wilson with ideas about the right reasons to go to war and the right way to shape the peace. And I'll return to the post-World War I peace settlement later in my talk. So, religion as a source of ideas at the top, but mostly I'll be talking about from the bottom, was extremely important. But Wilson was not the only religious person concerned with world politics at the time. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked an especially religious era. One historian has even called it another Great Awakening. And in the early 20th century, the churches were not only consumed with religious and political issues, they were obsessed with international relations. And it was they who provided much of the activism surrounding American intervention in World War I. Without this religious activism, both at home and abroad, religious ideas would have been fairly static and certainly undynamic. And of course, this is the era, this is the great era of missionary enterprise and missionary activity. But at home, too, people who weren't missionaries were incredibly active and incredibly vocal in debates over foreign policy. So the millions of religious Americans who looked at the world as it was and envisioned the world as it should be were responsible for putting these ideas in action. Wilson did not think or act in a vacuum. No president does, of course. And as a politician, he could not help but listen to a large number of voters on the most important issue of the day. By 1917, these constituents were demanding that America should enter the war to make the world safe for democracy. It was supposed to be a war to end all wars. And these are idealistic notions that I would submit make little sense unless you consider the religious context of the times. From the same era, the acquisition of the Philippines in 1899, and with it the establishment of America's first formal overseas colony, is another clear example of religion affecting the process and outcome of U.S. foreign policy. The candidates in the elections of 1896 and 1900, the Republican William McKinley and the Democrat William Jennings Bryan, were two of the most pious politicians in all of American history. The Methodist McKinley reluctantly supported colonialism. The Presbyterian Bryan did not. But both grounded their reasons in their faith. And a lot of historians see this as a mathematical equation. They were both religious. If they were both religious, how could religion possibly have influenced the outcome of this decision? They sort of cancel each other out, just like in math. But I don't see it that way. Both were supported by legions of activist Christians who were lobbying their government one way or the other. And the result was a peculiar compromise of sorts. Colonization of the Philippines, but with the intention to eventually grant the Filipinos independence and self-governance. This was certainly old-style European imperialism, but with an idealistic twist. All of the European powers pursued imperialism under an ostensibly idealistic banner, and the French in Indochina and their civilizing mission is probably the most obvious example. But thanks to the convergence of religious ideas and religious activism, only in the American case did this actually result in the implementation of an idealistic policy of sorts. Flawed, to be sure, even hypocritical, and the American occupation of the Philippines was shockingly brutal, even in the context of the times. But it does present a clear case of religion influencing the overall shape and overall direction of American foreign policy. The Philippines in World War I are, of course, textbook examples of the religious influence on American war and diplomacy, because they each marked such a clear instance of ideas and activism meeting in the White House of a particularly religious president. But the Philippines in World War I would argue, were not aberrations. The pattern of ideas and action converging to shape foreign policy, and just as importantly, the politics of foreign policy, has been constant since the founding of the Republic. Or even earlier. Historians habitually begin with the Puritan settlement of New England and usually refer to John Winthrop's famous sermon aboard the Arbella in 1630 as a kind of initial declaration of independence. One historian has even called him America's forgotten founding father. The Puritans, Winthrop declared in words that I'm sure all of you know, "shall be as a city on a hill, the eyes of the world are upon us." Here we are supposed to find the birth of American exceptionalism, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and the difference being quantitatively, Americans are exceptional because they're different from everybody else in the world. Qualitatively, Americans are exceptional because they're better than other people in the world. And I'll return to that theme. The importance of the Puritans is certainly true as far as it goes, but it also obscures the depth with which English Protestants already felt themselves to be exceptional. Indeed, I would argue that the truly influential foundations of American religious thought, at least as it pertains to American foreign relations, came in the late 16th century, when English Protestants, especially those such as Richard Hakluyt, who promoted the colonization of North America, began to perceive the protection of territory and ideas as equally vital to the maintenance of security. In other words, they thought of self-defense as both physical and ideological. The defense of land and ideas were equally important. They felt that being Protestant was inseparable from being English, and that if Protestantism were to survive in England, it had to survive elsewhere in Europe. If isolated, England could not remain a Protestant nation because it would eventually come under threat from a growing Catholic conspiracy, centered this time not in Rome, but in Madrid. Thus, the expansion of Protestantism and its strengthening where it already existed was thought to be vital to the survival, or to use a more modern phrase, to the national security of England itself. The Puritans who left Cambridge, England, to establish Cambridge, Massachusetts, what we in England call New Cambridge, believed in this worldview particularly strongly. It was, in fact, one of the main reasons for transplanting their purified brand of Protestantism to the howling wilderness of New England in the first place. And it was this conspiratorial view of Catholicism that provided the first foundations of American foreign affairs. The modern echoes of this early modern way of thinking can be heard in the debates over how best to confront the fascist threat, or the communist conspiracy, or the threat of Islamic terrorism. The echoes are perhaps loudest when Americans consider whether they can survive as Americans, and not just as another run-of-the-mill country, if they are the only democracy left on the planet, forced to be a part of a world system in which they have no friends, no allies, not even a role. As Franklin Roosevelt declared in his famous Four Freedoms Address of January 1941, quote, "Armed defense of democratic existence is now being gallantly waged in 4 continents. We are committed to full support of all those resolute peoples everywhere who are resisting aggression. We express our determination that the democratic cause shall prevail, and we strengthen the defense and the security of our own nation." So, values and physical security as inseparable. Now, this sounds not only like John Winthrop or Richard Hakluyt, it sounds an awful lot like George W. Bush. Consider this passage from his second inaugural in January 2005, and I promise I'll spare you with a Bush impression. We are led, as much as I was tempted to, but he said, quote, "We are led by events and common sense to one conclusion. The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world. America's vital interests and our deepest beliefs are now one. So it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world." Well, the Puritan sense of mission, what they called their errand into the wilderness, which is, I think, quite easily detectable in both Roosevelt and Bush's statements, was based on the notion that they'd cracked the code for the best way, the freest way to live life on Earth. And once they'd cracked that code, nobody was going to take it away from them. It was, it must be remembered, an English Protestant exceptionalism at first. But once here, allowed to grow in isolation, it flowered over time into a powerful American exceptionalism. And so, in the words of one historian, here we find the Puritan origins of American patriotism. In foreign policy terms, patriotism is simply exceptionalism in action. Americans were quantitatively different than other people, freer in all realms of life, political, religious, and economic, and these differences Americans thought made them better. Logically, being exceptional should lead a nation to be isolationist, so that its people can escape the taint of the rest of the unexceptional world. Contact would simply breed contagion. And there's some truth to this. But despite the air of exceptionalist superiority, Americans have always been very much of the world, not least through overseas trade, commercial enterprise, and missionary activity. There was no way to escape contact. So, in order to avoid contagion, the best way to make contact with the fallen outside world was to spread the blessings of American liberty. After all, if you make the world safe for democracy, you make the world safe for America. Excuse me. Most historians think of the short 19th century, from the end of the War of 1812 to the Spanish-American War in 1898, as a quiet time in U.S. foreign policy, with the Mexican-American War of 1846-48 being the exception that proves the rule. But this makes little sense, for the years between 1815 and 1898 also marked the era of relentless westward expansion. And in American high schools and even in universities, this is taught as part of domestic American history. It's not really part of the foreign relations curriculum. And yet, this itself, expansion, was a matter of both foreign and domestic policy, for whose lands were Americans moving into? At first French, but then also Spanish, British, Mexican, and of course, most tragically, Native American. And here we see patriotism, or exceptionalism, in action under the banner of a providential, divinely ordained manifest destiny. Consider these words from the Reverend Amariah Callick, preached in a National Fast Day sermon to members of the legislature of the state of Maine on August 3rd, 1849. And this sermon preached by Amariah Callick he preached this sermon in the state of Maine legislature, but he himself was the pastor of the West Rockport Baptist Church, which is about 3 miles away. So, in the words of Reverend Callick to the Maine legislature in August 1849, quote, "Our government is eminently free. Such a government, and such only, is adapted to secure the highest degree of national prosperity. Man was made to be free. Freedom is a part of his nature. His desires, his hopes, and his efforts are all of them either prompted by the possession or excited by the absence of this blessing. Neither is it possible for his nature to be fully developed, nor his powers to be completely appropriated to the great work of human life under any form of government which does not secure to him the most perfect and entire civil and religious freedom. The God of nations intends to accomplish by this nation what he has not yet done by any other. Our land was designed to be the home of the free." But as the good Reverend Callick made clear, there was more to American expansion than the idea that America was God's chosen land and Americans his chosen people to be protected forever by divine providence. To be sure, that thinking was evident. But religious liberty, the idea of religious liberty, was also at the very heart of American exceptionalism. And not simply religious liberty on its own, but the idea that the freedom to worship was essential to the expression of other freedoms. This goes back, of course, to 16th century and 17th century English Protestantism and back to the Puritans. Liberty itself was indivisible. Without religious liberty, society could not have political liberty, and vice versa. Without faith, there could be no democracy. One was an essential precondition for the other. Recall my reading from Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. The second of this quartet of essential freedoms was the freedom of religion. Not legal rights, such as habeas corpus or trial by jury. Not political freedom, as expressed through the ballot box and the right to vote. Not freedom of assembly. Not freedom of the press. Roosevelt boiled freedom and the cause for which Americans would lay down their lives in Europe and in the Pacific down to only four essentials, one of which was religious freedom. The others, of course, being freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so the promotion of religious freedom, just like the promotion of democracy itself, has been central to American foreign policy. Initially, up to the 20th century, the expression of religious freedom did not mean what we mean by it today. Americans did not mean that all people should have the right to worship as they saw fit. Instead, they wanted to preserve the freedom of their own religion. And by promoting their own religious freedom to others, they meant spreading their own belief system so that others could also enjoy it. This too began with the Puritans, who fled religious persecution in England. But they did not establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a haven for religious toleration. Instead, they wanted Massachusetts to become a new Jerusalem, a chosen land of a perfect Protestant society. And religious dissenters such as the Quakers and Hutchinson and Roger Williams found this out to their peril. And this manner of thinking is still evident in American thought today. Think of American democracy promotion, not just promoting democracy, but promoting the right kind of democracy, the kind of democracy that Americans will be happy to live with. And we've seen that in elections in the Middle East, most notably in Palestine with Hamas. Also, for the longest time, the American notion of religious freedom had at its heart a contradiction: anti-Catholicism. Catholicism was not free, Protestants charged. Instead, because Catholics were beholden to the dictatorial, conspiratorial Pope in Rome, they themselves presented a unique menace, a clear and present danger to the true flowering of liberty. Anti-Catholicism motivated American foreign policy, and the quotation marks are required for American for events before 1776, of course, but it certainly informed the American mindset in the frontier wars with the French in the early 18th century, in the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War of the 1750s and 60s, in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, and in the acquisition from Catholic Spain of the Philippines, itself populated by thousands and thousands of Catholics in 1899. But over time, the concept of religious liberty began to change, from one that promoted one religion over all others to one that embraced the basic right of people to worship as they saw fit. Partly this change resulted from pure politics, as the Catholic population grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with immigration. Anti-Catholicism was no longer so politically expedient. But it also reflects a much broader definition of freedom. Once more, we return to the second of FDR's four freedoms. He said, quote, to him, religious freedom was the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. Or we return to Bush's second inaugural, where he proclaimed that democracy was, quote, sustained in our national life by the truths of Sinai, the Sermon on the Mount, the words of the Quran, and the varied faiths of our people. It's tough to imagine John Winthrop saying something like that. Given this more inclusive and expansive definition of religious freedom and its essential relationship to democracy, it's no surprise that religious liberty became one of the main banners under which Americans resisted atheistic communism during the Cold War. Not for nothing was communism usually called godless in the 1940s and 50s. Communist doctrine called religion the opiate of the masses and denied the existence of God. Communism was also by definition materialistic and thus opposed to all things spiritual. But, said Americans at the time, the Soviet Union went beyond simple godless atheism. Communists didn't just deny God, they actually sought to eradicate religious following on earth. In other words, the Soviets weren't just atheists themselves, they weren't just content to be atheists themselves, they insisted, at the point of a gun, that all others must deny God too. Americans were now faced with an adversary who was motivated by the inverse of their own ideas and activism, just as ideological, just as idealistic, and just as activist. This, I would argue, helps to explain why the Soviet Union seemed to pose such a dire threat to America long before it could actually harm the United States itself. Anyone familiar with the Bill of Rights will recognize here the importance of the separation of church and state. And indeed, in the early Cold War, Americans criticized the Soviet Union's violation of this sacred principle. FDR, during the war, kind of glossed this over, and he got into a lot of trouble for doing so. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A session. But Harry Truman, for one, thought the very core of the Soviet threat to democracy lay in its violation of the church-state separation. He talked about this constantly, more than the denial of someone's right to vote. After World War II, a threat that was once academic and a problem only for Russians became especially acute and a problem for everyone when communist contempt for religion was wedded to the military might of the Red Army. And it's no surprise, then, that religious Americans mobilized their energies in opposition to communism to provide the ideological glue that held together a totally new, permanently interventionist foreign policy. In American rhetoric, fighting communist atheism, and especially fighting its suppression of religious freedom, were especially prevalent at both the beginning and at the end of the Cold War, less so in the stable middle of the Cold War, the period we call détente. In 1948, at the beginning, Truman led the way by declaring that, quote, all who cherish Christian and democratic institutions should unite against the common enemy. That enemy is the Soviet Union, which would substitute the Marxian doctrine of atheistic communism for revelation. It's quite a statement. That same year, Truman even attempted to organize a conference of world religious leaders, including, of course, Christian and Jewish leaders, but also Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim, to rally the forces of faith against a common worldwide atheist threat. And of course, in America, Truman was not alone. If communism represented the inversion, some said perversion, of all that America stood for, communism versus capitalism, dictatorship of the proletariat versus democracy, atheism versus religion, and if it seemed bent on world conquest, it presented a clear and present danger indeed. The religious fervor with which the Cold War roared to life culminated in the 1950s in yet another Great Awakening. And the most Great Awakenings I've found in somebody's work have been 5. The impact upon U.S. foreign policy was significant, helping to provide for a coherent, relatively unified anti-communist stance. But the effects on American religious life were just as profound. Here we see the beginning of the end for anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, and the emergence of a Judeo-Christian civil religion, a new phrase entirely. Old sectarian hatreds began to die off, didn't die off completely, of course, but began to die off when the contest no longer seemed to be Catholic versus Protestant or Christian versus Jew, but between believer and non-believer. American religion was just as significant at the end of the Cold War. Indeed, it's no coincidence that détente collapsed in the late 1970s at almost exactly the moment the religious right became a political force in American politics. Détente was Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger's solution to the problems confronting U.S. foreign policy in the wake of the Vietnam War. This was a time of not unprecedented, but rare relative American weakness in the world system. Nixon and Kissinger explicitly said America would stop crusading for its ideals and instead pursue, in a much more cold-blooded fashion, the national interest. If this meant dealing with the devil in Moscow or Beijing, so be it. This was unthinkable, immoral to the evangelicals, Protestant fundamentalists, and conservative Catholics who made up the religious right. Godless communism was evil, pure and simple, and it didn't make any sense to say that just because America faced powerful challengers, therefore America should stop challenging them altogether. Nixon and Kissinger pursued stability, but the religious right didn't want stability. It wanted justice, even at the expense of order. Evangelicals voted in record numbers for one of their own, Jimmy Carter, in the 1976 election. But when he, too, adopted détente as his foreign policy framework, they turned out in even greater numbers 4 years later to elect Ronald Reagan. And Reagan enthusiastically embraced the anti-communist cause, not simply for politics, but it was convenient that he did so. Fittingly, in 1983, he chose the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelicals to declare the Soviet Union an evil empire. Well, the religious right's exercise of political power on a national scale in the 1970s and 80s also highlighted a tremendous shift in American attitudes towards international organizations, such as the United Nations, but also all of the other organizations that I understand are very well represented here today, the World Bank and the WTO and so on and so forth. Given how supposedly disreputable the UN is today, and it's certainly viewed that way by a large number of Americans, probably a majority, it's difficult to remember just how broadly popular the UN was for the first 20 years or so of its existence. For the first half of the Cold War, the UN was generally seen by Americans to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. This positive attitude towards international organization was in large part a direct result of the liberal mainline ecumenical movement, which began in the late 19th century and picked up steam in the first half of the 20th. The ecumenical movement's mission was to bring Protestant denominations together under one roof, to undo the most extreme fragmentation or fragmentary effects of the Reformation. Not necessarily to break down denominational barriers and unite Protestant churches, although that did, of course, happen. Their goal was to get denominations talking so they could overcome tension. Coming together in bodies such as the Federal Council of Churches, or FCC, and later the National Council of Churches, and of course the World Council of Churches, would facilitate communication, which in turn would bring about cooperation. You get people together to talk, and they realize that that their differences aren't so great, and they have more in common than they realize. Communication breeds cooperation. Interdenominational peace would inevitably follow. The whole point of organizations like the FCC was to regularize, formalize, and institutionalize this process so that it was something much more than an occasional ad hoc gathering. Breaking down barriers of all kinds then became the FCC's overriding goal, including on matters of economics, and the FCC and its like-minded liberal mainline believers were very supportive of the New Deal and other statist measures towards regulating the economy. And on matters of race, the FCC was a pioneer in efforts to desegregate the South as early as 1910, 1911. And it's not difficult to see how these ideas could also be applicable to international relations. If an organization like the FCC, made up of independent denominations, could bring about religious peace, then an organization made up of independent states could bring about international peace. Recall my description at the beginning of my talk of religious Americans in the early 20th century as being obsessed with international relations. They made this their main cause, to bring countries together. The FCC and other Christians who shared their ecumenical view, such as Andrew Carnegie's Church Peace Union, led the way in calling for an international body that would reduce competition and insecurity and the armaments that came with competition and insecurity and foster international peace. They called for this long before the outbreak of World War I, long before the League of Nations, before Woodrow Wilson had ever heard the phrase League of Nations. And naturally, they were some of the most passionate, idealistic advocates of the League of Nations. Wilson himself had been active in the FCC before becoming president. He gave a special lecture when he was president of Princeton University at the FCC's founding inaugural meeting. And so he was already familiar with the potential of a multi-party cooperative organization. Once again, ideas brought to life by activism and brought to bear on U.S. foreign policy. The Senate's rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, and with it the League of Nations, led the ecumenicalists to redouble their efforts after World War I. But their newfound idealistic pacifism instead fed into isolationism. They weren't themselves isolationists, but their pacifism supported an isolationist climate. It was not until World War II, and with it the emergence of the crystal clear threat posed by Germany and Japan, that ecumenicalists had much of an impact. Gone was the interwar pacifism, now replaced, thanks to Reinhold Niebuhr, who was invoked, of course, last night, and I'm sure will be invoked again for the rest of this conference. So this was thanks to Reinhold Niebuhr and John Foster Dulles, with the more robust doctrine of Christian realism. Pacifism was dangerous, Niebuhr charged, because it allowed pernicious threats, such as Nazi Germany, to rise unchallenged. Niebuhr was an ecumenicalist himself, worked closely with the FCC, and thought that an international organization, but one backed with force, as the League of Nations was not, would be vital to maintaining what many called a just and durable peace. In fact, this was the name, a just and durable peace, of an influential wartime FCC commission on the post-war world, chaired by John Foster Dulles. In U.S. government planning, the concept of a permanent United Nations organization became central to ensuring that there would indeed be a just and durable peace, and with it, the functioning of collective security, led by the United States, came into being for the first time. And it's difficult to state just how revolutionary this was at the dawn of the Cold War. The whole notion of collective security had been unthinkable to previous generations of America, who took seriously George Washington's admonition in his 1796 farewell address that America should avoid entangling alliances. And yet now America was joining some of the most entangling alliances in world history. Here, Niebuhr, Dulles, and others offered was a formula for collective security that post-war Americans could accept. If ecumenical idealists of the World War I and interwar eras provided the collective, ecumenical realists, Christian realists, like Niebuhr and Dulles, provided the security. And also, as I said earlier, it's difficult to recall or remember just how popular the UN was. If you go through denominational archives and church records of the 1940s and 50s and early 60s in mainline churches, Congregationalists and Episcopalians and so forth, you'll come across lots of orders of service and pamphlets dedicated to UN Prayer Sunday, to entire services devoted to blessing the UN, Thanksgiving sermons for the efforts of the UN in bringing about international peace. But the UN was never popular with everyone. To the independent evangelical and separatist fundamentalist communities, it simply represented yet another instance of official collectivism, of governments straining for ever greater power at the expense of ordinary people like themselves. There was nothing so precious to evangelicals, especially to fundamentalists, as identity. They were the nonconformists of their day, and they held tightest to the doctrine of separating church from state because it protected them from government regulation. And to them, the UN represented the highest form of government regulation, a world state. They were also increasingly more nationalistic than their mainline counterparts, and they bristled at the limitation of American power that came with membership in an international body. Multilateralism in foreign policy runs contrary to the very core of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. Christian conservatives believe in a literal Bible whose narrative and message cannot be interpreted or compromised. A very different way of thinking from the diplomatic world. They believe in standing for certain principles that can never be called into question, whereas international organization requires pragmatic compromise on most issues. Not for nothing does the National Association of Evangelicals have as its official motto, cooperation without compromise. I'm not sure how you do that, but... And I can't imagine that being the motto for the UN. Being a member of an international organization requires participants to recognize and work with nations who have radically opposed, often irreconcilable worldviews. During the Cold War, this meant working with Soviet and Chinese communists or with states that refused to recognize the right of Israel to exist. And this is something the religious right was not willing to do. This also goes back to the notion of contagion. Again, it's no coincidence that the loss of love for UN, around the same time that Taunt was beginning to collapse, coincided with the altered political landscape in which evangelicals and fundamentalists were an increasingly dominant voice. Here again, we see the impact of ideas when they're given force by religious activism. That said, it's difficult to see where the religious influence on American diplomacy will go from here. But of course, thankfully, that's not the subject of my talk. And people here who are much more qualified than I am in looking at U.S. foreign policy and religion today will provide us with some answers over the next day and a half. But I'll bet that much of what they tell us will at heart be about when religious ideas meet religious activism. Thank you.